This pre-built is super interesting, and not only because they spelled their own name wrong on the front of the computer, but also because this pre-built is a lot more affordable than most of the other ones we've seen lately, and it's in a more unique form factor. So we went and specifically hunted down a Micro-ATX Pre-Built. That's what this is. This is a PowerSpec box, and it's under $1,000 right now. We've looked at a lot of $5,000 machines. They haven't gone well, so we're coming back down in price. Maybe it'll go better here. So this system has an R5 5600X and an RTX 3060. It's also interesting because it's from a company whose stuff we've never reviewed. PowerSpec is a house brand of Microcenter, similar to how ABS is a house brand of Newegg, or more simply, Amazon Basics is a house brand of Amazon. Go figure. This also serves, this brand, as a dumping ground for whatever inventory is left over at the end of the day for Microcenter that they need to get rid of. Having a pre-built division allows them to divert excess supply into something that they can repackage and sell to a different type of buyer, someone who's not buying for DIY purposes. So we're going to be reviewing the PowerSpec system today. This is a G513. Very interesting because the Micro-ATX form factor has got some predictable downsides, sadly, but there are good things too. Before that, this video is brought to you by Montech's Metal DT24 base. This 2-fan tower cooler keeps a simple black and metal look to match most build aesthetics, and it runs a 6 heat pipe design with 2 towers and 2 fans for higher performance air cooling. The Metal DT24 base can also accommodate taller memory modules because it cuts back the fin stack closest to the first DIMM slot. The Metal DT24 base uses a standard mounting mechanism and is easy to install. Learn more at the link in the description below. The number one thing that Microcenter has going for it is always price. And you've seen plenty of YouTubers do videos about Microcenter. We actually don't live near one here, but we've been to them a couple of times now. And we actually went and physically picked this up from one that's about 5 hours away from us for other reasons anyway. And they are best known probably for their price competitiveness, but a lot of that is through in-store only stuff. They do some online sales, just they try to draw people in so that they can sell them expensive USB keys to make up the margin on things that are cheaper. So this system, it has an R5 5600X, an RTX 3060, a 16 gigabyte set of 2 8 gigabyte sticks of DDR4 3200. It has a 1 terabyte M.2 SSD, and sadly, a stock AMD Wraith Stealth cooler. More on that later. The system has been on sale for $850 lately, but was more consistently $900. We're not sure if $850 is the new price now that the parts are aging, but that's pretty competitive. And one of the only things you might be able to save on here is the power supply, which is PowerSpec, or maybe with slightly cheaper fans. And it costs about the same to DIY, assuming you don't pay for Windows. Paying for Windows would possibly put you over the pre-built cost. Now, of course, there's a million caveats here. You could always just choose different components to get a cheaper version of this same build rather than a literal like for like, but we just wanted to see what sort of markup there is. And there's not a lot, at least not compared to other SIs. So in terms of part selection, right now, you can do a Ryzen 5000 series build for dirt cheap. I mean, the 5600s, if you haven't looked in a while, the non-Xs especially, are in the low hundreds at this point. 5600X, not so bad either. It's like mid to upper hundreds depending on where you're buying. And that means that DIY options to build the same box, you can get in pretty cheap. It's just, you have to pay some markup when you're asking someone to build the computer for you. Just you hope that it's not too much for the service you're getting. And so something like Alienware or Origin, we spent massive markup. On Origin, it was like $2,000 or something on the system we reviewed, and it came out not good. Historically, oddly, we found that the companies that have less markup often have mistakes that are more forgivable or easier to fix yourself. You shouldn't have to fix them, that's the problem, but if you have to fix them, at least you're not paying as much. We have some really brief backstory on PowerSpec as well, if you're interested. So it was founded in 1992, and it's actually part of the same corporate structure as Microcenter, as we said, but both are ultimately owned by Microelectronics Inc. PowerSpec's Pre-Built started out as a cheaper alternative to IBM's home computers of the day. PowerSpec previously made a handful of actual components as well, like video cards and motherboards. These days, they basically just do pre-builts, some power supplies, and a small handful of other products. But we don't normally give history on pre-builts, so let's get into the part that matters, the teardown. Then we'll go through thermals and the other tests. Teardown is going to be pretty straightforward. This is a Micro-ATX computer, so it'll tear down like a DIY system. But there are a few important things about the case that really restrict this thing. And of course, once again, it is an PowerSpec computer. So let's start with that front panel. This thing has no ventilation on the front. That's okay as long as the air can come from somewhere else. It doesn't have to come from the front on every case. And on this system, we've got a solid glass side panel for that side. On the right side, traditionally, we've got some ventilation, and also on the top, same ventilation pattern. This is where the problems begin. So on this panel, there is a relatively low porosity, which means that the amount of metal per hole we get is relatively low. And even worse still, when we take off the panel, you can see there's a dust filter behind it, which should be a nice feature, except this follows the much older design tenet that we have long since been correcting when we talk about cases. And that is to basically block all of the holes in the outer panel with the material used to make the filter for the inner panel. So not only is it low porosity anyway, but you're losing like half still of the ventilation here to breathe through because there's a filter behind it. Now, this is a matter of a case issue, not a build issue, like not a Microcenter problem, but it is a component selection problem. And that is because as we tear this thing down further, we see internally that they've got a downdraft cooler. And so this Wraith Stealth is not particularly powerful. It is relying on that ventilation from the panel to breathe in because the fan is blowing that direction. There are fans in the case. There's two in the bottom. There's one right there. There's one right there. The 120 in the back pushes its air straight into the GPU, which is great for the video card, but it does mean not much of that is going to get up to the CPU. The one in the front goes up towards the CPU. None of it really makes it into the power supply. That's a different issue we'll talk about. So this goes up. It'll find its way in, and then an 80 mil fan in the back pulls the air out of the case. So this small fan right here is all you get for exhaust, which is fine, but it is pulling a lot of weight. Now, the top panel has similar problems to the side panels. Won't go over that again, but there's not a lot of room for exhaust to come out of there. The front panel has its own issues, first of which are mine. The front panel has some ventilation here on the sides, and the only reason this becomes relevant, because as stated, we don't really need the front panel to be open for the core components. They're trying to breathe from the side, maybe a little bit from the top in that CPU cooler. So this is actually an important side note, but people like to fall back on the technically true physics property of heat rises, which again, technically true. Blowing air through a 2000 RPM fan kind of becomes irrelevant. So the rate of molecular movement is, it's been a while since I read the thermodynamics textbook, but it's only like 4% for every 25 degrees Celsius increase at a molecular level. So the fans will overcome that. But this is going to end up pulling some air in through the top, or at least whatever it can, given that presence of the filter. So anyway, the thing with the front panel, this is where all of the air for the power supply comes in. So the power supply, you see, has its intake here, and its exhaust is not down there. That means it's at the top. So the power supply, half of it is cut off by this front panel. So it's relying on this small area to get the heat out of the box. As long as it's a good power supply, it can withstand that kind of beating, but this is really restrictive on the PSU because it doesn't have much place to breathe, and it doesn't have much place to get rid of the heat either. Probably this should be oriented so that the power supply fan is on this side, and it's able to basically help the rest of the system pull air through. It's going to steal a little bit from the CPU, but if I were Microcenter, I'd probably move one of those bottom fans to the top as intake. Now you're feeding one straight into the GPU and one straight into the CPU. If they oriented it that way, it would work great. Now, the only reason to bring all of this up in such detail is because the thermals are a problem. And they don't have to be. That's the frustrating part. But we can move on past that. Let's get to the actual teardown itself. Means I have to lower the teardown table. So we're just gonna, let's give it a minute. I've gone too far. We're coming back up. The motherboard is technically a commercial board, meaning it's not a DIY consumer type board, but you can find it online. It's got a small VRM heatsink over here covering this half the VRM. That's the more significant part. There's our 80 mil fan. There is a power pass through. That's what that is right there. So that's coming all the way over to the power supply to get you power out the back of the case. and it is actually secure. We've seen problems with that in the past. Cable management is nothing special, but not bad either. They've basically resorted to shoving all of the cables down here in the case, which is fine. That area is kind of dead space anyway, not particularly useful. Any glue? You're not shipping it, so there shouldn't be glue. Nope, no glue on the USB cable. Really hard to remove that 24 pin. Okay. In terms of the cabling on the back, they really only have this one cable going to the CPU. That is the pass-through for power. You can see their kind of checklist for QC up here. We've got signatures of several people here who missed the hour spec. Not sure how that happened. That's really all there is for cables. Let's get the rest of this apart. Let's see if there's anything particularly dumb. GPU comes out first. I'm working with our toolkit. You can grab one on store.gamersnexus.net. Helps us out directly, and it is carefully tuned, especially for video card disassembly. You can also grab our mod mat that I'm working on down here on the surface if you want to grab a build surface for your PCs. Video card came out no problem. It's just an Asus, looks like a dual card. It's a 3060. Let's look at the RAM they're using. So the RAM is from Neo Forza, which we've really only seen in pre-built. It's available on Newegg. It's very cheap memory. Is DDR4 3200. It says CL16. We'd have to look at the subtimings, and each stick is 8 gigabytes. I'm gonna take a look at the NVMe drive now. So using a WD Blue SN570 drive. This is an NVMe SSD, single-sided. I'm gonna check all the screws now. I'm not gonna pull the board out. All right, we got one loose screw in the top right. It wasn't too bad. It was about a half turn off of tight. And again, no shipping involved in this one. Screws were mostly fine. Now for these bottom fans, these are Lian Li fans, which makes sense because again, Lian Li ships in some of these cases. These are 1300 RPM, 12 volt, 0.2 amp fans. Overall, they're doing pretty well here for the build. We have photos too of the original thermal paste application with this cooler. It's since been removed by our team because we had to swap it because the cooler's really not good for this. We'll talk about that in a minute. Thermal paste application was completely fine. It looks like it may have even been the stock application on the cooler when it ships. So that's it for the teardown. There's really not a lot going on here. I don't need to take apart the entire thing to see the problems. All of the problems are related to the case, basically. And the biggest issues, it's not Microcenter who made the case. It's Microcenter who chose the parts, though. And that's kind of why it matters. So Microcenter has done well on just building the computer. It's the selection of this problem. And for that, let's move on to our thermal testing and show you why. We'll jump right into the charts that highlight the system's biggest flaw, CPU thermals. This is what they look like under a heavy torture workload on the CPU and the GPU. That flat line starting to form represents hitting a hard thermal limit, which will impact performance. Somehow, we keep finding pre-built PCs that throttle out of the box. This is like a universal problem, and it's embarrassing that these companies struggle so much with it. The Ryzen 5600X inside reached 95 degrees Celsius in just under 3 minutes, and as soon as we saw this, it was honestly just deeply disappointing because we bought this one thinking it'd probably be a pretty positive benchmark session. This isn't like Ryzen 7000 where we expect to see 95 degrees under normal conditions. It's not the intended behavior for the 5000 series and before. Simply put, the CPU cooling is woefully inadequate for this PowerSpec PC. This is mostly the fault of the included stock Wraith Stealth, which is tiny and demonstrably insufficient here. There's a lot more room in the case for a taller, better cooler. And the case itself is also problematic, as we talked about in the teardown. The porosity of the panels is just too low, especially with the included filters on almost every panel. Contributing to the poor thermal performance is the fact that all of the fans were set to the motherboard's silent preset by default, preventing them from ramping up all the way. For the next test pass, we locked the two bottom intake fans and the rear exhaust fan to 100% speed. The CPU still hits 95 degrees. It just takes 52 seconds longer to get there. This performance, it's just unacceptable. Even with all the case fans going as hard as they can, the Wraith Stealth is insufficient. The real answer here is to use a different CPU cooler that can actually do the job. It's not hitting spec. The CPU is dropping clocks in a massive way as a combination of the cooler and the case. Pick one. You can have a bad case, you can have a bad cooler. If you have both, you have a bad computer. And here's the crazy thing. They got one of the lowest power, most efficient CPUs we've looked at in a decade, a Ryzen 5600X, and that CPU draws 67 watts under a full blender load in our testing, and they still managed to get it to overheat. So to prove how effortless it is to fix this problem if you're Microcenter, we took one of the better, cheaper coolers we have, a $20 Thermalright Spirit Assassin, which these days is called something, it's called the Thermalright Assassin X 120 SE or the Assassin King 120 SE. We've taken that cooler, we put it into the system, and well, here's the result. The new cooler took up nearly all 150 millimeters of clearance available, so it's a good fit. We left the case fans at 100% here and used that as a control just against the prior test. For $20, we've prevented the CPU from throttling, and by a wide margin. T-die at steady state stops just shy of 78 degrees Celsius in our controlled 21C test environment after about 19 minutes of full system load, and it's so much better for such a small investment that it makes us think PowerSpec didn't spend any time actually testing the part choice before approving the configuration. The end user could replace the cooler themselves just as we did. It's not that hard. You could do it with the motherboard still seated in the case. Problem is, as we always say, you should not have to change a single thing in your pre-built for it to perform properly. We don't know what it is with these pre-built companies, SIs, OEMs, struggling with this. Like, why is thermal such a hard problem to solve? Because it's solved. You need to test it. And in the case of some brands, pull your head out of your ass long enough to see that the sticking with these old chassis designs like Alienware or using the cheapest possible cooler, it hurts you in the long run. It makes the company look incompetent. And if you do a Google search for something like computer overheating, question mark, this is something that a lot of people who don't have DIY experience, have never built a computer. It's something they're familiar with. If the average end user can come up with the phrase, my computer is overheating, it means it's a pretty common problem. Now, the reason we're frustrated with this is because otherwise, as you saw in the teardown, this is pretty well built. It's very standard, which is a good thing. That's not an insult. They don't need to go over the top. There's nothing to go over the top with. They built it properly. They chose a bad cooler and a bad case, at least in combination. You do one or the other, as we showed. But it's just it falls short when pre-builts really have to clear the bar of hits product spec. That's all we want. It's not a high bar. Here's a look at the outcome of that thermal behavior, tested using Blender rendering for this one. With everything in the stock configuration, the system was only able to maintain an average of 4,050 megahertz across all 6 cores at steady state. That is way lower than we expect from the CPU. For reference, our original 5600X review had the CPU running 350 megahertz faster in the same exact test. Setting the case fans to 100% nets the system 75 megahertz more on average. But once again, the real solution is just to keep the CPU's thermals in check. With the Assassin Spirit in place, instead, steady state average jumps to 4,350, which is way closer to full performance. So all it would take to fix this is for PowerSpec to pick a basic tower like this one. It's a frustratingly simple solution, and one that can be solved for like dollars if they just bought bulk on AliExpress or something. GPU thermals are up now. In the stock configuration under our full system torture test, the RTX 3060 held steady state at 77 degrees Celsius. It's not bad on the face of it, but we have more than just the face. The case fans at 100% only brought it down to 74 degrees Celsius, but because the GPU fan speed behavior is dynamic based on temperature, we have to look at the fan speed as well because we didn't lock it. We allowed it to do what it wanted to do. The GPU's fans topped out around 2,670 RPM in the stock configuration, which is 92% duty cycle for this card. Running that close to max means that the GPU is not only struggling to maintain its VBIOS temperature target, but it has very little overhead to keep maintaining it. With the case fans maxed out, the peak was at 270 RPM lower than stock, thanks to the extra fresh air coming in from the bottom. And this proves that the card is maxing out on the curve in order to keep up, with a poor choice of hardware combined in this build. Time to get into setup, instructions, software, and BIOS. This should be a place Microcenter does well. We got this system at a physical Microcenter store, which is the only way we're aware of that you can get one. Because of this, PowerSpec only has to worry about the PC making it from its warehouse to the retail store, most likely on a pallet, which is more secure. So, it's packed in a basic double-layer cardboard box with medium-density closed-cell foam cut to fit, which is adequate. The case is the Lianli Lancool 185M, which is exclusive to Microcenter and can be purchased separately. It's also nearly identical to the Sama IM01, with a couple differences, like the lack of a vertical GPU mount. Sama is a major supplier of cases, and actually Lianli buys from them. So if you haven't heard of them, it's because they're normally rebranded. Both of them obviously draw massive inspiration from the N-Case M1, which isn't surprising considering that Lianli actually manufactures that case. So yes, Lianli owns its own factories, but it still occasionally buys from Sama as a supplier for cheaper cases. Like we said in the intro, the front panel is missing the P in PowerSpec, and it wasn't in any of the packet. It's likely been missing since it was assembled, which makes us wonder about PowerSpec's QC process. If you can't get the logo right, it's no wonder that the thermals are so hard. It doesn't bother us, but it is literally the only thing you can see of note from outside of the case, so it should have been caught. Inside the case, there wasn't any packing foam or dedicated GPU support, but this is fine because the 3060 is light and they know they won't be shipping it. And as soon as we opened the box, we were greeted by an info page printed on a regular printer paper sheet with a couple notes. It says to install the wireless antennas before powering on the PC, and it directs the user to use the display out connections on the video card rather than the motherboard. This is all great advice. Pretty standard, but it's very important information. Technically, it says that the motherboard display connector is disabled, but that's true because the 5600X doesn't have integrated graphics anyway. The included keyboard and mouse place somewhere between basic and e-waste tier. The keyboard's left shift sticks when you press it off to one side, and the mouse is about the same style you'd find with a Dell system. The only other thing in the box is a resealable plastic bag with a power cable, wireless antenna, and 2 extra SATA cables, and then the quick start guide. There's no motherboard manual. We wish that were included though because it'd help out less experienced users with future hardware upgrades. On to BIOS and software. The motherboard is the ASRock B550M-C, so at least you can get to the BIOSes and the manual. The BIOS version wasn't as up to date as it should have been. Version 1.40 shipped on the system, but that's dated for March of 2022. So it's over a year before we bought the system. More recent versions include packages from October of 2022, and since the outer box helpfully gives us a build date of December 8th, 2022, we know that the more recent BIOS was available and it should have been installed. So not only has this pre-built been on the shelf a long time, but the parts that went into it were probably on the shelf even longer, and it explains why these pre-builts exist. This is how Microcenter moves old hardware. The BIOS didn't have anything set up incorrectly that we could find. XMP was on out of the box, so that's a big point for PowerSpec, and good. Both 4G decoding and rebar were enabled by default as well. The decoding is useful in case you add a GPU with tons of VRAM, and rebar being on is good for getting the most out of GPUs, especially if you end up using Intel Arc. All of the fan headers were set to the silent profile out of the box, which contributed to the thermal issues we talked about earlier, and the first boot of the system didn't exhibit any erroneous behavior outside of a slight drone-like tone from the fans. After the initial Windows 11 setup, we were greeted by a simple PowerSpec branded background image. The only thing that showed up was the most polite bundled antivirus prompt we've ever seen. It actually asked us if we wanted to run the installer or not. And upon clicking no, it asked us if we wanted to entirely remove both the installer and this reminder. Typically in a pre-built review, we perform all the benchmarks without removing anything out of the box to get the true experience. But in a situation where it asks us like this, we'll take it. This is how you offer the balance of an option for software that people normally don't want and just allowing people to blast it all away. Scrolling through the list of programs in the start menu showed a lack of any other bloatware unless you count RGB software, but you need that to configure the LEDs, so it's fine. Unfortunately, the NVIDIA graphics driver that came on the system was also out of date. It was version 517.48, which was released on September 27th of 2022, so it's 5 versions behind as of the December 8 build date for the machine, and even more since we bought it. Just like with the BIOS version, PowerSpec should be using the latest GPU driver available when the system is built. So unfortunately, this would have been a neutral to positive review if not for PowerSpec's ignorance when it comes to CPU cooling. And it genuinely is very frustrating for us because we started, I liked this system when I saw it. I saw it on the floor basically at a Microcenter physical store, and I looked at it. It's like, okay, it looks like maybe thermally it'll struggle, but I didn't know if it would overheat or not until obviously we tested it. But the main thing I liked was Micro-ATX. It's cheap, relatively anyway, compared to what we've seen lately. The parts were reasonable for the CPU and the GPU. They made sense to go together. A 5600X and a 3060, that's a good pairing. It's not like some of the companies where, like Dell, will sell you 64 gigabytes of RAM and i3 and some weird GPU that all together really don't make a lot of sense. So this pairing was good, and the assembly is good. The form factor is cool and actually pretty practical. And then they fall short on thermal. So that's where it went from neutral to positive to sort of critical, I guess. We still like it. It's just you'd have to pull the cooler out. It's just sad to get that close and fumble over something so cheap and easy, and they're not the only ones. We've looked at a lot of computers lately, and it's almost like this is the only test we should run at this point because so few of them pass it. Now, we think PowerSpec was trying to cut as much cost as possible in the name of the final sticker price, and it ended up making a poor decision on the trade-offs. On the positive side, we really liked the simple and unbloated OS. The only included software other than the RGB stuff was a pop-up that says, do you want this included software? And if you say no, then it asks if you want to get rid of not only the software, but the installer and all the pop-ups and notifications and reminders for it. That's awesome. That's really good customer service, and it puts like some basic trust in the user's competence that they know what they want. And a lot of users know that they don't want random bloat from OEMs on their computer, and that PowerSpec comes out of the box and says, do you want to remove this? That's great. So if only they could solve the other problems, they're in a really good position. If that's indicative of how PowerSpec configures all of its pre-builts, then it's ahead of some other SIs in that respect. The system was undamaged, except for the missing letter P, and it didn't have anything physically misconfigured, except for the missing letter P. The BIOS was configured mostly sensibly. That was good. It had XMP enabled, which is rare. Rebar was on. That's good. Our only issue was the default silent fan curves to add some insult to injury on the thermals. Now, for those of you in our audience who don't mind changing a CPU cooler, but you want either the rest of the work done for you or maybe the price is lower, it depends, right? Like when we're reviewing this, the price is fluctuating all the time at a physical store like Microcenter. But if it happens to be one of the cheaper ways to get what you want and you're okay with swapping the cooler, then great, whatever, go ahead and do it. But if you're trying to find something to recommend to someone and you don't want to do that for them and become their customer support, where forever afterwards you get to hear it was fine until you messed with it, then you should just recommend something else. And we have looked at computers that were good. I mean, Skytech had one really pretty good one and one big miss. ABS was good last time we looked at it. There have been some others that weren't too bad. Shockingly, CyberPower and iWayPower have occasionally been reasonably competent, but the thing that they screw up is also thermal on the CPU. So anyway, that's the review for the PowerSpec PC. We really like just about everything except for the thermal problem, and that is enough. If it doesn't hit spec, then we can't recommend it. It is the lowest possible bar to set. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, if you have ideas for what we should review next from pre-builds, let us know, because we are specifically right now trying to find one that is good. Like at least hits the marketed specs, ideally good. So let us know what you've seen out there that you think will meet that bar. We're not trying to find another train wreck meme fest. We'll find one of those later. That's all for now. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by grabbing one of our mod mats like what I did the teardown on, or one of our toolkits or other items like our coaster packs. And you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time.